Okay, well, hello and welcome to our program today. My name is Corey Williams and I work here at the Fayetteville Public Library, and I'm so happy to virtually see you all here. One little housekeeping note to reduce the background noise and interruptions. Please keep your microphones muted and use the chat area for questions and comments. And thank you in advance for that. And I'm delighted to welcome Eric Fuselier as our presenter this evening. Dr. Smith was supposed to be joining us, but she wasn't able to come. So Eric is graciously filling in. And he actually kicked off our entire American Wetlands series. So he's going to be doing our final one tonight, which is kind of fun. And he'll be discussing the wetlands and climate change. And Eric, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Corey. I appreciate it. Glad that it kind of worked out. That I was able to fill in. So I already had a presentation that was pretty much put together so on this topic. So it kind of worked out. So yeah, if you haven't seen the presentation I gave a couple of weeks ago, then or if you have seen it, I should say, there's going to be a small amount of overlap, mostly in the introduction, but if not, then this should be fine. So we'll just go ahead and get started here. But basically, we'll be talking about the interplay between wetlands and climate change and how the two kind of affect each other. So, all right. So basically, we're going to start off basic. What is a wetland? Well, a wetland, these are areas that are inundated or saturated by surface or groundwater at a frequency and duration sufficient to support a prevalence of vegetation that is typically adapted for life in saturated soil conditions. Another way to think about it is these are transition areas between land that is permanently wet and land that is permanently dry. And so if you saw my presentation a couple of weeks ago, this introductory part's going to be pretty much the same. So we're going to have a little overlap, but to give you kind of some examples of wetlands, river deltas, where rivers are kind of meeting larger bodies of water or the ocean. You know, these like the photo you see here, there's this land area, and then as the river level goes up, it's going to flood these areas, and so you won't see this land exposed. But eventually that water level goes down and the land becomes exposed again. So vegetation that lives especially adapted to these types of habitats, are able to handle saturated soil. Some species are able to handle that inundation, periodic inundation, or sometimes permanent flooding, but they're all rooted vegetation as opposed to some deep water aquatic plant species, which are going to have floating roots or floating foliage and that sort of thing, and are more adapted to deeper water. So wetland vegetation is typically about the size of the terrestrial vegetation. It's just adapted to these transition areas between land that is permanently wet and permanently dry. Another example of areas where we find wetlands are in estuaries. This is where you have a freshwater river that's meeting a saltwater system, and some of that brackish saltwater kind of backs up into the estuary, and then due to fluctuating water levels, you will have wetlands in these locations. Marshes, these are going to be places with predominantly herbaceous vegetation, as opposed to woody vegetation. And these are going to be along coasts and areas, saltwater marshes. So whenever, the tide comes in, water levels go up, inundates these areas, or, storm surges, that sort of thing will bring water into these marshes, these coastal marshes, and then eventually that water level will go back down. Another type of wetland, swamps. This is one we might be more familiar with inland. There are coastal swamps as well. These are going to, of course, be flooded forests. These have woody vegetation with trees. Two common trees that you find in the swamps here in Arkansas are going to be your bald cypress and your tupelo. Both of those species will form those knees that are very characteristic of freshwater swamps. And the water levels, depending on the source of hydrology for these, whether it's some of them border rivers. And so as water levels go up in the river, they flood these swampy areas. Some of them are old oxbows, especially in the Mississippi River alluvial valley. And so they're, can be either seasonally flooded or periodically flooded. Bogs and fens. These are going to be more of your open areas, depending on the source of hydrology, and as well as the pH there is going to determine whether or not it is a bog or fen, and have an impact on the plant communities. And then there are some wetlands that are more seasonal. These will be dry part of the year. You'll go out, or you may just have a high water table to where you may never have any inundation. And so whenever that during the spring and the wet season, that water table comes up and it never rises above the surface, but it gets close enough to the surface to support predominantly hydrophytic vegetation. But the rest of the year it may be dry, and you might not know unless you know how to identify the vegetation and how to look for hydric soil indicators of the soil. Then there are prairie potholes. These are dominant up there in the northern Great Plains, North Dakota, southern Canada area. These are seasonal or ephemeral wetlands, very important for migrating waterfowl. They go up there in the springtime when the spring rains fill up these pothole areas with water. They breed there, raise their young before heading south whenever it starts to become winter again. But during the dry season, these will dry up. So these are what are considered ephemeral wetlands. They're only around during the wet season. So what about some common types of wetlands we have here in Northwest Arkansas? Well, most of the wetlands we have here are going to be pretty small. We don't have the larger swamps like they do in eastern Arkansas. In fact, the wetlands here in Northwest Arkansas only cover about 1.5% to 2% of the land in our region. One example is going to be our wet prairies. This is a pic photo of Woolsey Wet Prairie over on the west side of Fayetteville. These are, were once much more common. We've developed some of these, but these are basically prairies where you have either seasonal water due to water collecting in low areas or water table coming up and flooding certain parts of these, and they'll support predominantly hydrophytic vegetation. These ephemeral wetlands are also very important for amphibians that might rely on these like vernal pools and whatnot to have places for their eggs, little nurseries or habitat. And that way, and then by the time they're drying up, these eggs have hatched and they become adult salamanders or frogs. Here's an example of a wet prairie in Bentonville. This is taken over south of 14th Street over in the west part of town. It's a pretty large area with, you can see this darker area. This is just organic matter. It's kind of built up. This was taken in the early spring before we had gotten a lot of rain. And so a lot of it was still a little bit dry, or at least the soil was still moist and saturated, but there wasn't as much standing water. We went out there now, you might be a little more standing water. And we also have wet glades. Glades are areas where the bedrock is very close to the soil surface. So that bedrock is a restrictive layer. Oftentimes water, the groundwater table is perched on top of that bedrock. So when we have the type of karst topography that we have here in the Ozarks, whether it be a spring that is coming out into that glade area or some other form, maybe like a seep of some kind, it will just kind of sit there on top of that bedrock and keep the soil saturated even throughout the growing season. So that will support a special kind of plant community when within these certain specific types of glades. Not all glades are wet glades, but we do have some that are. And then seeps, these are where groundwater is kind of seeping out through that karst topography, through our, porous geography or geology that we have underneath us, where we have, caves and springs and whatnot, and the groundwater is kind of moving, kind of like Swiss cheese is one analogy they give for that karst geology. But difference between a seep and a spring, whereas a spring is going to come out in a single point, seeps tend to kind of come out in a more diffuse area. So it's a little more seepage as opposed to, a single point where that groundwater is exiting the subterranean environment. Here's an example of a seep in Fayetteville over on the west side of, or I'm sorry, the north side of Mount Kessler. Here's one in southern Washington County over at Blackburn Bluffs Preserve, which is managed by the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. I actually took a video. I wish I had included the video, but you can actually see the water is kind of flowing out of this seep. It's just this big wet area that water is diffusely flowing. They had enough rain that there was a flow the day that I took that photo. And then we have these lacustrine fringes. These are often going to be associated with the edges of deep water habitats like lakes, ponds. So this is a photo of a lacustrine wetland along the edge of Beaver Lake. Now, if you recall, like the lake, if we get a lot of rain water drains into the lake, the lake level goes up. And then occasionally they have to let water out of the dam, or when it gets hot, water evaporates and the lake level goes down. Well, along the edge of the lake, you get with that undulating water level, you're going to have specific vegetation that is adapted to those alternating water levels. So it can handle the periodic inundation or periodic soil saturation, but it's also terrestrial, still considered a terrestrial vegetation or a hydrophyte. And so this is what makes it a wetland, since it represents that transition between permanently wet and permanently dry environments. We also have fringe wetlands around the edges of ponds. And this is one over in Benton County. This was taken early spring, so you can see the fescue is green because that's a cool season grass, so it's typically green throughout the winter. But the Ludwigia that you see there in the foreground is still brown because it's that's left over from last year. But a lot of ponds have the same type behavior, if you will, as a lake, where the water levels go up and down depending on heat, evaporation rates, evapotranspiration rates, with the plants transpiring water, as well as water coming in to that water body. There's another pond in Fayetteville. This is over near Kessler Mountain Regional Park. You see in the foreground, I took this photo in February, so the vegetation was not very green, but you can see in the foreground is what's called soft rush or Juncus effusus, and in the background is some American lotus. So, but this is an area where along the edge, the water stays inundated and it's able to support that hydrophytic vegetation, and then the water level will later go down. Here's an example of a fringe wetland along a pond in Bentonville. Again, with the Juncus effusus, I took this a little later in the year, and you can start to see it starting to green up there here in this area. And then we have riparian wetlands. These are going to be along edges of stream banks, especially when that stream bank is within the floodplain. And so whenever that water level goes up, it floods out into the floodplain, and then the vegetation, that happens often enough, you're going to get special vegetation there that is able to handle that periodic inundation. And these are the type of wetlands that account for most of the wetland acreage in our region. We don't have these huge swampy areas like they do in eastern Arkansas, but we do have a lot of streams, and these water levels will go up onto the floodplains and create these wetlands here in Northwest Arkansas. And I'll explain a little bit of why these are important here in a bit. But here's a photo of that's me taking some notes out at a riparian wetland along Clabber Creek. This is just downstream of the Wilson Springs Preserve. As you can see, it's pretty flooded there. Here's a riparian wetland along the creek. I believe this might be Osage Creek. It's that Southwest 28th Street in Bentonville that you see in the background with the cars crossing. I took this photo after we had all the flooding a few weeks ago. Went out, and you can see how a lot of that vegetation has been pushed over. You can see how the bank is pretty low down to the creek. So that is part of the floodplain. So when that creek level goes up, that stuff stays underwater, and the groundwater table, which is typically, close to where you see the top of the surface water in the creek, you can see how that's going to be pretty close, not too far underground for where these plants are growing. So if you extend that water table from the, level of the creek over, that's typically where the water table is going to be. All right, so how does climate change impact wetlands? So let's talk a little bit about the different variables of climate change and the impact that would have on wetlands. So what about temperature changes? Well, climate change, such as drought, the effects of climate change such as drought, warmer temperatures, and changing precipitation patterns can all affect the health and beneficial functionality of wetlands. Wetlands they're dependent on water. They need water for them to do their thing to support the vegetation. So, when we have drought, warmer temperatures, where that water is evaporating, and there's less water, then of course that's going to affect the health of that wetland ecosystem. Also, warmer temperatures, drought And changing precipitation patterns can increase evapotranspiration and lead to water losses. So changes in the timing and amount of precipitation will result in more frequent drying and or flooding. One of the things that they are expecting in this region from climate change is periods of drought and then periods of heavy rainfall like we saw a few weeks ago. This affects both the quantity and quality of the water supply, which wetland ecosystems depend on. And it not only affects the wetland ecosystems, but also their buffer communities. So these buffer communities, these are these upland ecosystems or upland plant communities that are on the edge of the wetland community systems. And these buffer communities, they offer all kinds of benefits to, protecting these wetland ecosystems from runoff, slowing down runoff, or, they act as kind of the first wall of defense, so to speak, for these wetland ecosystems. So changes in temperatures and precipitation are also going to, they expect it to affect upland plant communities, where these upland trees are going to experience a higher mortality due to climate change. All right, so what about the impacts on the soil? Well, drought and wetland disturbance is expected to result in a loss of carbon stored in the soil, which will in turn result in changes to the soil structure. A lot of soil organic matter serves as glue that kind of helps clump up some soil and create pore space so that water can filter down through. Are you okay? Can't help this. This thing on. Okay. And I'll talk here in a little bit about how we're going to the impact or how water helps with carbon, storing carbon and just creating these anoxic conditions, and how that helps sequester carbon. So whenever we lose these anoxic conditions, you start getting more oxygen into these areas when they're less wet. It's going to increase the rate of decomposition of the organic matter that was once being sequestered in these wetland ecosystems. Also, drought is going to increase events such as wildflowers, which can also alter water quality and the structure and function of wetlands and watersheds. So they're already in severe drought out west, and they're already starting to see some bad wildfires. And if you recall, we had some bad droughts here in the Ozarks several years ago, and there was some wildfires out near the Buffalo region area and Boxley Valley. So as we start to see drier climates during the summer times, this might be a little bit more of our common experience like they have out west. All right, what about wetlands and sea level rise? If we're having more glacier melt and ice cap melt, then when the sea levels rise, many scientists predict that rapid rate of sea level rise will outpace the evolutionary adaptive capacity of coastal wetland flora and fauna. So heavy development pressures in most of these coastal areas is going to restrict the ability of wetlands to naturally migrate inward. They talk about how certainly a large percentage of our human population lives along coast. Back whenever before, when a lot of things and goods and stuff were traded by seas and boats and whatnot, and people live in ports, and this is where a lot of development has historically occurred. This development, is going to, whereas if this development was not here, then these ecosystems would have been able to somewhat move inward to adapt to these rising sea levels, but development pressure is going to make that much more difficult. So coastal communities are being heavily damaged from extreme storm events and sea level rise, and these inland communities, such as ourselves, are being impacted by severe flooding and drought. So without these coastal wetlands, whether they be swamps, whether they be marshes, to be able to handle that sea level rise and these storm surges, we're going to see a lot more flooding in our urban environments along the coast, such as we've already have started to see in this century, becoming much more common. And then we think about the cumulative impacts of all this. Climate changes in combination with other stressors such as land development, which may further exacerbate the loss of wetlands. Like I mentioned, most of the wetlands here in Northwest Arkansas are pretty small. We don't have really huge ones, but we have enough that are small enough that the more they get developed, the more impervious surfaces we have, the more runoff that we're going to have during these heavy storm events. And then there's less water being stored in these wetlands during the drought. So the groundwater recharge that these wetlands, even the small ones, help provide isn't there to help sustain creek flows during the during the summer and the dry season, as well as groundwater for certain endangered species as our cavefish. All right, so how do wetlands help mitigate the human causes of climate change? And this is where we're really going to get into some carbon sequestration. So plants, when they, through photosynthesis, they take in carbon dioxide, right? They take it in through the stomata on the underside of their leaves. Then they take up H2O from their roots and then use photosynthesis to combine these, break it apart, and put them together to create glucose. And what they have left over afterwards is oxygen, O2. And so that's why they exhale oxygen. And then humans and other animals like ourselves, we inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. But whenever these plants are taking in CO2, they're incorporated into their biomass, especially if they're woody species like trees, and they're able to build that biomass in their woody species. You just sit down, okay, sweetie? Sorry, I got my 5-year-old here with me. So what happens though is when these plants eventually die, and like a tree falls down and it sinks to the bottom of the wetland where it stays waterlogged, and you have these anoxic conditions without, because whenever you have these permanently saturated soils, usually the oxygen level in these areas are very, very low. And so that slows down the rate of decomposition of the organic matter or the plant material, because the microorganisms that live in these anoxic conditions metabolize much, much slower than microorganisms that live in a more aerated environment. So the rate of decomposition is happening much, much slower than the rate at which more carbon and organic matter is being added. So that's why wetland soils tend to be very, very dark, very, very high in organic matter. And that's why, several hundred years ago, people, and even as recent as 100 years ago, people were draining these wetlands and turning them into agricultural lands, because that soil is very, very fertile. It's been accumulating organic matter for centuries or millennia. So when we get rid of these wetlands, we're losing the carbon sequestration that they're able to help mitigate a lot of the carbon that we're putting out through burning fossil fuels. All right, so coastal wetlands are estimated to sequester twice as much carbon in their soil than all the tropical forests. So think about that. A younger freshwater wetland, which is going to be more inland, and disturbed wetlands can emit carbon until they can develop sufficiently to a certain stage when they are starting to sequester carbon. So older freshwater wetlands, where you're going to have a lot more trees, these are due to forest succession. These, probably started off one day as a more emergent wetland like we saw, or freshwater wetland like we saw in this picture here. But as the plant communities develop and go through different successional stages, and they get to that forest stage, then not only are they sequestering carbon in the soil, they're also sequestering carbon in the biomass of the trees as well. But a lot of the difference between the ability of tropical forests to sequester carbon is they're limited by the limit that those trees can grow. They can only grow so high, there can only be so much. So once they reach that limit, they effectively aren't able to sequester any more carbon. Whereas in the wetland soils, because organic matter is accumulating faster than it's being decomposed, that can hypothetically just continue to build up organic matter and continue to sequester this carbon. All right, so what about wetlands and adaptation to climate change? How can wetlands help us as a society adapt to climate change? And this is going to be a lot with have to do with the ecosystem services that wetlands provide. Well, what are ecosystem services? These are the many and varied benefits that the natural environment provides to human society. And so when we're talking about the ecosystem services provided by wetlands and how they could help with our ability to adapt to climate change, this is specifically going to be their role in the hydrologic cycle, their ability to improve water quality, and also the habitat that they're providing for fish, wildlife, and native plants. So climate change is expected to result in changes to the hydrologic cycle, including altered precipitation and snowmelt patterns. Well, wetlands could help offset these changes by storing water and reducing the effects of storms, of droughts and severe storms. Wetlands are often likened to a giant sponge. After a heavy rainfall, they are able to soak up and store a lot of the storm water and then release it slowly. Especially as the amount of impervious surfaces continues to expand, as our region continues to grow, stormwater has to go somewhere if it's not able to be soaked into the ground. So where does it go? It goes sideways to the edge of the street, to the nearest storm drain. And then, when you get a lot of this flash flooding like we saw a couple weeks ago. So where these wetlands are able to help capture the flow of the surface water and then gradually release it after the peak flood flows have passed. But through this, they're able to reduce the frequency and intensity of floods by absorbing and storing significant amounts of stormwater, which helps reduce property damage and erosion downstream. So here's a photo that was out there in the paper a couple weeks ago. This was taken across the interstate from my office. This was a lot of flooding that occurred. And this is just an example of climate change increasing storm intensity, resulting in increased stormwater runoff. Like I mentioned earlier, the impervious surfaces block rain from soaking into the ground, and this increases the amount of runoff going sideways. So when you get urban areas where we have higher concentration of these impervious surfaces, that runoff is going to flow at higher speeds and in larger quantities, leading to flash flooding. This is a photo taken by Christopher Paxton, the floodplain manager for the city of Rogers. A lot of people probably recognize this creek, but this is a kind of flash flooding that we might start to see a little more often, and we have been seeing a lot more often here in the past several years. So again, this accelerates stream bank erosion downstream, which increases the turbidity levels of the water. And if you don't know what turbidity is, that is basically the amount of suspended sediment floating in the water, which is harmful to aquatic ecosystems. For one thing, when you have dirty, murky water, light is not able to penetrate the water column deeply enough to facilitate photosynthesis of the algae in that water. And like I said, what happens with photosynthesis is plants are exhaling oxygen. So when the algae in the water are able to photosynthesize, they're able to put dissolved oxygen into the water that fish and other aquatic organisms need to breathe, such as macroinvertebrates, insect larvae, that sort of thing. So when there's less photosynthetic activity, they will start to suffocate. Another potential bad thing, another potential negative effect of the turbidity levels in the stream is the soil particles can launch into the gills of the fish and prevent their ability to take in oxygen level through there too. So when wetlands act as these natural sponges by capturing and slowing down the flow of surface water and then gradually release it, this helps with not only reducing the frequency and intensity of floods by absorbing significant amounts of stormwater, but the tree roots and mats and other wetland vegetation help slow down the speed of these flood waters, distributes them more slowly over the floodplains, so that way it's less intense and less concentrated in the streams. So this combined water storage and breaking action lowers flood heights and reduces erosion. And also when it's able to be stored in these wetlands for longer, that turbidity or sediment will have more time to settle out and settle to the bottom of the wetland. So the cumulative presence of wetlands and lakes in a watershed can reduce flood flows during these big storm events. So when you have even a lot of small wetlands, they can have a cumulative effect to act as a giant wetland in a region. So wetlands within and downstream of urban areas are particularly valuable, counteracting greatly increased rate and volume of surface water runoff from pavement and buildings. Here's a photo of, this is Eastern Arkansas. This is at the White River National Wildlife Refuge, but just to kind of give an example, the bottomland hardwood riparian wetlands along the Mississippi River are thought to have once stored at least 60 days of flood water. However, now they're estimated to only store 12 days because most have been filled or drained. Coastal wetlands and marshes help buffer the storm surge from hurricanes. So whenever we are seeing a lot of these wetlands go away, like it's happening in South Louisiana, we're going to see these storm surges that are going to get further inland and do more property damage because the wetland vegetation isn't able to help slow down. The wetlands aren't able to store that storm water, and so it's going to have more of an impact on society. Not only that, but I mentioned that wetlands are also a source of surface and groundwater recharge in the drying landscape. So during the dry summer months, when these wetlands are holding water, they're able to help contribute to the groundwater table. And so when you get perennial and intermittent streams, a lot of the source of these is coming up from the bottom in these types of streams. It is fed in part by groundwater. So whenever the groundwater table goes down and it goes down below the bottom of the stream bank, the stream bed, that's when you see an intermittent stream dry up. Perennial streams are the type that stay flowing year round. However, some of these perennial streams might not be able to sustain flows if that groundwater table continues to go down during the drier months and isn't able to continue to feed that water to the stream. So they help keep waters flowing in streams, which helps offset the effects of summer droughts on aquatic species. So think about these aquatic species living in these ecosystems that require this water, or at least a complete part or all of their life cycle. And without that water, they're not going to be able to do that. Not only that, but groundwater recharge, but they're also able to help out with water quality, improving water quality. Wetlands are called the kidneys of the landscape because of that ability to help filter and purify water. So increased stormwater runoff carries more contaminants that are harmful to water quality, aquatic ecosystems, and other wildlife. Think about all the drippings from cars. One second. You think about all these drippings that happen from cars, like automobile fluids, oil, and whatnot. It drips onto the surface of the the pavement, and when these rains come along, it dislodges that or starts to pick up some of these contaminants and carries it along in the streams. So this is these where do they go? They go to the nearest aquatic ecosystem. They have negative impacts on the things that live there. Also, when the flow of surface water is slowed down or contained, like I mentioned earlier, sediment has more time to settle out and settle to the bottom, and so that helps reduce the turbidity levels of water after heavy storm events. So wetlands can help improve water quality of nearby rivers and streams by eliminating many pollutants before they reach our local drinking water sources. So, and through the cycles of wetting and drying, combined with the bacteria and plants that live in these habitats, wetlands can sequester, alter, and or assimilate contaminants such as excess nutrients, heavy metals, and petroleum products. And if you saw my presentation a couple of weeks ago, I went into a little bit more in depth on the specific species and the specific contaminants that they're able to help remediate. But just know that a lot of these wetland ecosystems are helping to purify water, break down contaminants to make our drinking water cleaner. So their role in water quality management will contribute to our ability to adapt to climate change. Not only that, but wetlands are provide wildlife habitat. Like I mentioned, the vernal pools earlier and their importance with migrating waterfowl. Wetlands provide food, habitat, and shelter for many species of birds, fish, insects, amphibians, reptiles, and other wildlife. Wetlands are some of the most biologically productive ecosystems in the world. It's estimated that a third of threatened and endangered species in the lower 48 states live only in wetlands. An additional 20% use or inhabit wetlands at some time in their life cycles. And so wetlands are going to help provide refuge from the effects of climate change for many species. They provide amphibians refuge from heat and drought. Wetlands also help reduce the effects of drought and heat have on other wildlife by providing a source of water or moist, cool microclimates. As the climate changes, wetlands also provide a corridor or stepping stone on the landscape that may help species move to better areas. So the loss of wetlands can also lead to reduced habitat for fish and wildlife and worsen existing shifts in species ranges. So species that were once uncommon in an area may be encountered more frequently as their ranges shift with climate change. A local issue of concern is the Ozark cavefish. This is one that depends on groundwater being in the underground subterranean environment in the caves. So if we don't have the wetlands that are contributing to that groundwater recharge, and we're having more impervious surfaces, it's causing less water to soak into the ground, more of it to run off. That's going to be less water that is there to support these Ozark cavefish populations. Not only that, but because of their biodiversity, these ecosystems are often popular places for recreational activities such as fishing, hunting, birding, hiking, and photography. So think about this newly opened Osage Park in Bentonville. This is one that has just recently opened to the public. I really encourage you to go out there and check it out. It has a boardwalk trail through the wetland area. Woolsey Wet Prairie also open to the public. It's a wildlife sanctuary. It's a popular destination for birders and botanists and herpetologists alike. The University of Arkansas also uses it for research for their herpetology department. Wilson Springs Preserve in Fayetteville. This is a large wetland area. If you go out, they often have to, it's managed by the land trust, and they often have to close it down after a heavy rain event because it will flood, and it's not accessible at that point. But it is providing a lot of those ecosystem services for the people that live in the neighborhoods around it and downstream, and preventing the flood waters from getting into their houses or causing erosion on their own properties. And then there is a wetland down southeast of town, kind of out towards West Fork, but still in Fayetteville along Dead Horse Mountain Road. This one is being managed by the Watershed Conservation Resource Center. They're preserving 98 acres south of Huntsville Road along the West Fork of the White River at the southeast edge of town. I apologize. The center is a nonprofit in the city that focuses on watershed restoration and education, and they do have plans to make it the land accessible to visitors. So once they do that, I really encourage you to go out and go visit this wetland area. And I mentioned recreation and tourism. One of the things that we've done with the South Central chapter of the Society of Wetland Scientists is organize these educational events for the public. In 2019, we organized a wetland ecology tour. A year before that, we had the Northwest Arkansas birding tour, where we've invited the public out to come look at these various wetland areas and learn more about the flora and fauna that depend on these habitats to live. So then we held these as fundraisers for our chapter. And then this, yeah, okay. Forgot what I was going to say, but here are some photos from some of these events. We have on the right some photos from the wetland ecology tour, and on the left some photos from the birding tour where Joe Nill led a group of about 40 people to go see the birds out the Charlie Craig Fish Hatchery, which is fed by springs. So these activities help stimulate local economies. They bring visitors to locally owned stores, restaurants, and hotels, resulting in additional income for these businesses, as well as a tax benefit to cities. Think about eastern Arkansas, the wetlands there and their importance to waterfowl and how the recreational activities from all the duck hunters that go out there during duck season and all the income that they're bringing to the local small little towns in that region. And so this is the point I really want to drive home in this whole series here that we're doing, is the importance of wetlands. And I really want to point out that we have already lost a significant number of the wetlands in our country. If you recall, I mentioned how a lot of them were previously drained because of the fertile soils that they had, and they're used for agriculture. And it's estimated that since the 1700s, the United States has lost over 50% of our wetland resources. So here is an aerial photograph of Northwest Arkansas in 1984. And I want you to compare that with the aerial photograph of 2018 and look at how much more impervious surfaces we have now than we did. And they're expecting our region to continue growing. We're not finished growing. So, we really want to drive this point home that the wetlands that we have left, we really need to think about how we grow and develop to do so responsibly, ethically, and to make sure that we're not creating more of these flash flood events, that we're not taking away water from these habitats that not only are important to wildlife and aquatic organisms, but they also provide a benefit to society as well, whether it be from stormwater control, water purification, improving water quality, and whatnot. So here's a photo of the Fayetteville Springdale area in 1984. And then here it is, 2018. We've done a lot of growing during those years. And we'll probably continue to grow more into the decades to come. Here is Rogers and Bentonville in 1984. Here we are in 2018. 84, 2018. So what can we do as citizens? Well, we can preserve and enhance any wetlands that you have on your own property if you're lucky enough to happen to own a wetland. I wish I did. You could support local watershed groups such as the Beaver Watershed Alliance, the Illinois River Watershed Partnership, and Ozark Water Watch. A lot of these are involved in conservation efforts that are meant to help improve water quality and whatnot in these watersheds. So implement green infrastructure on your property, such as rain gardens and bioswales. Advocate for wetland protection at planning commission meetings and in other public forums. So if you're aware of a wetland where development may start to occur or is being threatened by development, it might be helpful to go advocate for the protection of that wetland. Establish stream and what can local governments do? Well, they can establish stream and wetland protection programs such as protection ordinances, zoning regulations that include wetland conservancy. Establish expert regulatory boards and advisory committees for wetlands. Adopt local real estate tax incentives for wetlands. There are places out east, local governments that have real estate tax incentives for people that are doing things to restore and preserve and conserve wetlands on their properties. Preserve and protect wetlands owned local government lands such as parks, greenways, and forested areas, or even restore and construct wetlands for pollution control, stormwater, or for parks and recreation. Osage Park is a great example of how they used a naturally occurring wetland and turned it into an amenity beyond the services it was already providing. They can implement green infrastructure and natural infrastructure projects such as rain gardens and bioswales on city property. So in case you're not familiar with these terms, what is green infrastructure? Well, these are engineered systems such as rain gardens, bioswales, and green roofs that mimic the functions of natural systems such as wetlands. So think of a rain garden as like a little miniature wetland. A detention pond associated with residential development can be thought of as like a temporary miniature wetland. But if we were to vegetate these with more better vegetation, natural wetland vegetation that's helping to break down contaminants, they could be so much more functional than just by storing stormwater. I see a lot of them that are just put lawn grass in them, and I just feel like they could be so much more than just grassy pits or swells. So Green infrastructure provides localized flood control, reduces the flow intensity of creeks during storm events. This is a bioswale in a parking lot down the south part of Fayetteville near the University of Arkansas. Bioswales also help improve water quality by filtering stormwater. Here's a picture of a bioswale that is over at the wastewater treatment plant on the west side of Fayetteville. And so whenever the rainwater, stormwater runoff is flowing through this, that vegetation helps slow it down, and that increases infiltration into the soil. And all the plants are able to do their thing where the roots are able to help facilitate the breakdown of contaminants. And this also helps recharge groundwater supplies. So here's an example of a rainwater and bioswale project that I was involved with here at Crafton Toll along Beaver Lake. That's Beaver Lake in the background. This is at Hickory Creek Marina, associated with the low impact development project that we designed and partnered with the Beaver Watershed Alliance on. So I included a rain garden. So here's a picture of the rain garden. These are vegetated depressions designed to capture and slow down runoff and help reduce soil erosion, allow more time for stormwater runoff to be absorbed by that soil. So whenever the rain garden starts to fill up too much, we have this bioswale that's also able to help transfer the runoff into the lake through this. The vegetation hasn't quite gotten established yet, but you can see where it's been planted along the sides there. So this will help slow down that stormwater runoff and allow more time for it to sink into the soil. So what are the benefits of natural infrastructure? Well, natural infrastructure approaches include forest, floodplain, and wetland protection, watershed restoration, and wetland restoration, and conservation easements. So whenever you're utilizing this in conjunction with green infrastructure, you can get these hybrid systems. So that's really, I think, keeping what's already there, learning how to enhance it, learning how to work with nature, and we can avoid a lot of the ill effects that we're already starting to see, hopefully avoid or at least mitigate or reduce the ill effects that we're starting to see from climate change. Natural infrastructure, such as healthy wetlands, can provide many of the same benefits of traditional human-made infrastructure at a much lower overall investment and maintenance cost. Unlike traditional human-made structures, a well-designed and maintained natural infrastructure project will not depreciate like an artificial system, and in fact may actually increase in value over time. So they produce many ancillary benefits such as wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, water filtration, groundwater storage, and floodwater attenuation. With that, I want to conclude my presentation by just giving a brief mention of the Society of Wetland Scientists. We're a professional organization that is here to help promote the understanding, conservation, protection, restoration, and science-based management and sustainability of wetlands. We produce wetland research and also try to educate the public through the events like I mentioned earlier to help with wetland conservation. So here's my contact information. If you would like to reach out to me via email or via telephone, you're more than welcome to do so. And I will conclude my presentation there.
Thank you so much, Eric. If anyone has any questions, you can put them into the chat. But since you were talking about like different stormwater solutions, I wanted to plug the program that you're doing for us in a few weeks in June. I know you're doing it with a few other people. It's called Low Impact Development Techniques. And I believe you're going to be talking about the different things that homeowners can do. And that's on Saturday, June 12th at 2 o'clock. So
this will be focused on residential applications of low impact development techniques. And Lee Porter of Ozark Green Roofs and Jane Magnot, the water quality agent for Washington County, will be co-presenting on that one. And we'll be talking about everything from rain gardens to green roofs to rain barrels to different things homeowners can do to help slow down, store, and help stormwater soak into the soil.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and let's see, I think everyone don't have any questions so far, just lots of thank yous, Eric. Yeah, I know that I don't feel like many people in Northwest Arkansas aren't affected by a lot of the flooding that we've been having lately, or with just flash flooding, not really just flooding.
Right.
Yeah, I know my yard has suffered from it, so.
Yeah, I was driving around town and the day it was all coming down and just saw all the vehicles that were hydrolocked and stuck, and yeah, it was bad. You know, I know down South Louisiana, they're having some bad flooding right now as well. You know, some of my relatives' homes are getting flooded, damaged just from the heavy rains that are happening.
Definitely.
Climate change is changing. It's happening.
It is. I had a question and then it just went right out of my mind. Maybe I'll think of it in just a second.
I'm filling in for Dr. Smith, so I probably won't be able to answer a lot of the carbon questions that she probably would have been able to answer as well as she could. But
okay.
just filling in here, so go easy if you do have questions, and if not, then no worries.
Yeah, well, I bet you know the answer to this one. How do we contact the Society for Wetland Prairie Tours, and do they have a website?
What, the Society for Wetland Scientists?
Yeah, I guess whichever society it was that offers the Wetland Prairie Tours.
That was just kind of an annual event that Jody Murray Burns of Cattails Environmental and myself were organizing, and we were starting to organize one last year at Wilson Springs Preserve in conjunction with Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. But due to COVID, we decided to call that off. But hopefully, whenever things are able to open back up and we feel like we can hold these events without being a risk to public health, and maybe we can start having these again. So I would just you could follow our Facebook page, or Jody's the current president of the South Central chapter. You can reach out to her, and but yeah, whenever we start holding these again, we'll be putting out advertisements for that event. There are other eco tours that happen now in other parts of the country, like South Louisiana. You can take kayak tours of wetlands, guided kayak tours. They have kayak trails in Central Arkansas. You can take a kayak out to the Bell Slough Wildlife Management Area, other swamp areas on your own. Yeah, as far as the Society of Wetland Scientists, we only had 2 of them. We had planned to make it an annual event, but so far we've only had the 2, and then we had to stop this year and last year. So hopefully those will resume. But the land trust, I mean, there's you can go out to some of their properties like Wilson Springs Preserve and hike around anytime.
Okay, thank you.
As long as it's open. They do close it when it floods.
Okay. Yeah. And they can find the contact information on that Facebook page.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Our website is sws.org if you wanted to check out our website. We do post it under events there. But
great, thank you, Eric. Well, and if there aren't any more questions, I think we might be done for the afternoon. Let's see. Oh, Trudy gave some compliments to your 5-year-old. Said she behaved amazingly well.
She did very, very good. You want to come say hi, Arrow? Yeah, I know she really wants to. She was as quiet as she possibly could be, and I'm so thankful she was as quiet as she was. So you waved to everybody. So she's been sticking it out this whole hour. Thank you. You did very good. Had to remind her a few times, but that's pretty normal for 5.
Oh yeah, she's only 5.
Right. I'm lucky she's as patient as she sits through board meetings with me. I'm very fortunate. So.
Great. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I think we're done. Thank you so much, Eric. That was really great.
Definitely.
And yeah, and thank you for such a great series that we've had so far. So.
Yep, I'm glad you enjoyed it. So I'll sign off here and I'll see you soon.
All right, thank you all.